Austin. I'm the director for the Center for Entrepreneurial Government at the Kansas Policy Institute. A little bit about me. I am not uncomfortable speaking to young adults. I am actually a professor at Washburn. I teach microeconomics. I think it's our sophomore level course. So, whether you're freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors, it really doesn't matter. What I hope to get out of this type of discussion, I don't want to bore you because I see those faces all the time sometimes when I teach. So I want to try to create this as an interactive experience as possible. So if you have any questions, feel free to stop me, feel free to ask. I'll also pause at certain parts to make sure you guys understand everything, because if I can't make this, complicated policy something easy for you to grasp, then I'm not doing my job right. Does that make sense? So I really need you guys to be open and blunt, and there's no stupid questions. Where do I come from? So before I talk about the Kansas Policy Institute, I am originally from New York. I came to Kansas and I went to Washburn because it was cheap and my parents could not afford to send me anywhere else. I was smart enough, but like, even though I got like half of my tuition covered at like really good schools, we couldn't even cover the rest of it. So I went to Washburn, had a great experience there. After Washburn, I interned for Governor Sam Brownback. I got promoted. I became an economic advisor in 2014. After the gubernatorial re-election campaign, I worked in the Kansas Department of Revenue as their economist. During that time, I also went back to school. I went to KU to get my graduate's degree in economics. Left for a little bit, went to Missouri, came back to Kansas, became chief economist at the Kansas Department of Revenue. So once you guys all start working, I'm not sure if you're all working yet, but trust me, I know how to tax each and every one of you if you really want to know. After that, I was recognized by the American Enterprise Institute, so think tank, conservative think tank out in DC, in regards to as an emerging poverty scholar. So these guys really think that I know at least something when it comes to helping lift people out of poverty. And then for about almost 2 years now, I've been working at the Kansas Policy Institute. And this title of my little subgroup, the Center for Entrepreneurial Government, basically it's looking at ways that we can find government to be, as it says, more entrepreneurial. And what that means is there a way that your city government, your county government, your state government, is there a way that they can provide a better service to you at a better price? And usually when we're talking about government, we're talking about prices that you pay. It's usually taxes. But sometimes it's not always taxes. Sometimes it's regulations. Sometimes it's just overall burden, paperwork you have to file. All those are prices you pay to get the government services that you think society needs. And so I'll go across the state speaking to different governments, particularly, of course, the Kansas state government, to figure out ways that they can provide better services at a better cost to you. So what we're talking about today is Medicaid expansion. Our discussion, I think, will delve us into a couple of topics. I can't talk about the policy if you don't even know what the policy is. So first thing we're going to talk about is what is Medicaid expansion. Then we'll get on to, I think, the second best important question: is it good policy? We'll talk about the bipartisan Medicaid expansion bill. There's, of course, a bill being considered in the Kansas legislature right now that is being sponsored by both a Republican and a Democrat, technically bipartisan. We'll talk about the good, the bad, the ugly of it. We'll summarize, and then questions. But as I said before, I want you to ask me questions all throughout this thing. Don't hold it to the end because you're going to forget. I know I do. So, what is Medicaid expansion? Well, first, let's understand what we have today. What I would call traditional Medicaid, this is working, this is not present. Traditional Medicaid is a state and federal policy that provides health insurance. First thing you need to understand is, what did I say? State and federal policy to help provide health insurance. Did I say health care? No. So one of the first things you need to understand about Medicaid expansion is that it's not health care, right? It is a way to pay for health insurance. And because it's government run, it's a taxpayer subsidy to cover somebody else's medical bills. And we'll come back to that later. So who does traditional Medicaid cover? I have it up here if you can't read it. I say pregnant women, blind or disabled persons, families making less than 38% of the, that PL stands for federal poverty level, and children. And children, I mean 0 to 19 years of age. When we talk about Medicaid expansion does not affect the people under traditional Medicaid. It affects those who are not there, right? So it'll affect non-disabled adults with no children, and up to 133% of the federal poverty level. So, let's understand that. Traditional Medicaid covers pregnant women, blind or disabled people, adults, as long as they make under 30% of poverty limits, and children. Medicaid expansion only covers adults. And it's adults that are non-disabled. Non-disabled adults. Doesn't matter if they have children or not, because children are covered under traditional Medicaid. So there's sometimes you'll hear arguments out there saying, look, if we expand traditional Medicaid, we're helping all these children. No. Expansion does not help children, right? Expansion only covers non-disabled adults. What they're telling you is that because of expansion, more children will go into traditional Medicaid, right? But that's not unique to expansion. How it's paid for. Under traditional Medicaid, the state pays for roughly about 46% of the cost. Federal government covers the rest, 54% or so. And under Medicaid expansion, the federal government covers 90%, which means the state pays for 10. Any questions on that? You guys understand, expansion covers adults, 19 to 64. Traditional Medicaid covers pregnant women, disabled families making less than 30% of poverty level, and of course children. And then you see how it's broken out in terms of the state pay for. So let's go into whether Medicaid expansion is generally good policy. And to do that, we're going to touch on 3 topics. The first, Medicaid expansion is directly related to the health of Kansans. Well, it's a tax subsidy, but it's a tax subsidy to pay for someone's medical bills. So what we'll ask is that Medicaid expansion is the best policy to improve Kansans' health. Then we're going to go into whether Medicaid expansion improves the state budget. Why we go into that particular question? Because as good as a policy can be, it's paid for through our taxes and our tax dollars. So are we getting a good bang for the buck? Because when it comes to improving the quality of life, the government can spend as much money as it most possibly can to help an individual, but that means it's losing something else. It can't pay for something else. Or our taxes have to be raised. So we want to see whether Medicaid expansion really does help the state budget if it's not that big of a burden. And then the last one is whether Medicaid expansion saves struggling hospitals. Has anyone heard the argument that we need to expand Medicaid because it will help the rural hospital out in some city or some county? So we're going to get into that and see whether it's really true or not. So is Medicaid expansion the best policy to improve Kansans' health? To answer that question, we're going to look at some academic studies on expansion. And something else that you may not have intended. We're going to look at some consequences that we see for those on traditional Medicaid. First off, let's talk about the academic studies for expansion. I'm going to list 3 here from the University of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and then one that's commonly termed as the Oregon experiment. The University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine did a study, and they found Medicaid patients tend to experience health outcomes worse than those under private insurance, even after adjusting for economic, admission, and other factors. Okay, that's one study. Here's the University of Virginia. They did a random sample, about 900,000 surgeries over 4 years, and they found Medicaid patients were 93% more likely to pass away than those with private insurance. The Oregon experiment. This one was a very interesting one. It was a randomized controlled study. And what they found was Medicaid coverage generated no significant improvements in physical health outcomes within the first 2 years. Let's try to take a step back and understand what this information is telling us. We'll start with the Oregon experiment here. What is Medicaid expansion? Is it healthcare? No. It's me giving you money to pay your medical bills when you go to the hospital. That's what expansion is. It's just the government, is the implementation, is the tool that it's being done. With that being said, whether the government gives you money or I give you money, does that affect the health care that you get when you go to the hospital or your doctor? If I gave you money to go see the doctor, the government gave you money, the same amount of money to go see the doctor, is your health going to be improved any bit? No. Why? Because all I'm doing is giving you money. I'm not telling you where you necessarily can go. I'm not telling you what health care you can actually provide. right? When this tells you that Medicaid coverage generated no significant improvements in measured health outcomes for the first 2 years, and this is relative to private insurance, it's because when you compare Medicaid to private insurance, all you're changing is the money that you're being used to pay for this healthcare. You're not changing the actual service or product you're actually getting. So relative to private insurance, this is no different. Expansion is only a financial product. It's only a tool. It's only a taxpayer subsidy. It is not actual healthcare. And then these two studies, what they try to tell you is that Medicaid patients, the type of patients that they are, unfortunately, are more susceptible to seeing worse health outcomes than those with private insurance. And when I talk about private insurance, 9 times out of 10, I'm talking about those who have private insurance through getting a job. So having a health benefit, getting your health insurance covered. Any questions? A lot of information. Michael?
So not all of us have a background in stats. So
Okay.
Why on the University of Pennsylvania, why is it so important that this study controlled for economic admission and other stuff?
Well, usually in statistics, and then branching out to a lot of other, whether it's business, psychology, economics, or just the natural sciences, you want to hold all else equal, because when you're trying to show some sort of causality, right, have some sort of cause, some sort of effect, many people can look at that relationship and say, hey, but you didn't figure in the fact that Medicaid patients tend to be poorer than those who have private insurance. Did you control for that? Because I bet that can affect health outcomes as opposed to just it being Medicaid. And so the study said, you're right, so let's control for that factor. Then someone else may say, but did you control for the types of admissions into those hospitals? Certain types of admissions can be more susceptible to having worse health outcomes than those with private insurance. So University of Pennsylvania says, you know what, you're right, so we're going to control for admission. And so they do their best to try to control all other type of lurking factors that could affect that cause and effect. And what they found was even after adjusting for, let's say, economic differences, admission differences, they still found that Medicaid patients tend to experience health outcomes worse than those under private insurance, which tells you that Medicaid, in particular, that program, isn't a savior when it comes to improved health outcomes, especially when you compare it to those who have a job and have private insurance. Thank you, Michael. Okay, expansion is a financial product. It is not healthcare. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to Medicaid expansion, even though it's a taxpayer subsidy for those adults between 19 and 64 years of age, making under 138% of the federal poverty limit, unfortunately the program, even though it doesn't directly affect those under traditional Medicaid, it still has a way of having some sort of what you call an externality. And that's because money has fungibility. What does that mean? If you go up to Starbucks, what'd you get there, by the way?
It was the whatever their pineapple thing is. Yeah.
Never mind, I don't like matcha. The dollar that you decide to spend on that matcha green pineapple tea thing is unfortunately the same dollar you can't spend on a Snickers, a candy bar, right? Money has fungibility, which means it has many different uses. So when it comes to the state, the more state resources, the more state dollars that are devoted to Medicaid expansion, those dollars can't be used for traditional Medicaid patients. Does that make sense? Now, I don't want to go back, but if we go back far enough to one of my prior slides, I said the state pays for roughly half for traditional Medicaid patients and then pays for 10% of expansion. Oh, and by the way, that fungibility argument I just made, it came from Health and Human Services under Obama's administration. And as I said before, so under expansion, pregnant women, disabled persons, children, very low-income families, they are pushed to the back of the line to make room for able-bodied, childless adults. Now, pushed to the back of the line is kind of the nomenclature, the language that's being used, but to be a bit more technical, doesn't necessarily mean that, let's say, a disabled child on a line is being cut, right? Someone Medicaid expansion is being moved in front of them. But what it does mean is that resources can't get to them because it's being devoted towards Medicaid expansion. So that's what I mean. They wait longer. Not that someone necessarily moves in front of them, though arguably it could be true. Okay, let's see if we can watch this video. Oh no, of course not. Nope. It's all right, one moment. There are multiple ways to do this.
Michael,
Yes.
is your audio setting on the computer itself pushing through HDMI?
I thought so, but let me back out. Sorry, bear with me one moment, I do apologize. Looks like it should be fine. So I brought up another video, the same video here, let me see if that works. Of course not. But here's what we can do. I'm sorry, we'll just have to read it. Actually, give me 1 second, I have one more idea.
So they did an MRI about 3 days after birth, and that's when they got her actual diagnosis,
Yes, just
which
listen.
is schizencephaly. It took me years to even learn how to spell it, but it's very rare. It's about 1 in 100. I'm Lindsay Overman, and this is Skylar Overman. I had Skylar when I was 20, and when I was pregnant, they knew that something was not quite right. We had talked to neurosurgeons thinking maybe she'd have to have surgery, and they weren't real sure, so they did an MRI about 3 days after birth, and that's when they got her actual diagnosis, which is schizencephaly. It took me years to even learn how to spell it, but it's very rare. It's about 1 in 100,000 kids. Pretty much, she had a stroke in utero, and so not all of her brain tissue was able to develop. So she's got what's called bilateral open lip schizencephaly. So when you look at an MRI of hers compared to someone else's, she's got big clefts of fluid on both sides and in the front. It was devastating because not only was I a new mom, I was a single mom. And so, I'm a single mom, never had kids before, I'm 20 years old, and then it was doctor after doctor after doctor. She's never gonna walk, she's never gonna talk. I hadn't even seen her at this point because they took her straight to the NICU. And so I'm being told all of these things that she's never gonna do, and I've never even met her. There is no treatment or cure for schizencephaly. It's everything that comes with it. I mean, she takes 10 to 12 medicines a day for seizures and, different things, allergies, and everything that comes with it. And so, we go to the doctor sometimes, 3 or 4 times a month. We have 3 appointments just in 1 week of April. And so that is what we spend our, her life doing, is treating the symptoms and treat what comes with it and try to, prolong her life and give her the best life possible. We wake up, medicine. And then if there's not school, then, there's tube feeds and, baths and, and if there is school, we get her on the bus. She goes to school. She has a wonderful school that she's with a nurse actually all day. She has a one-on-one nurse. And then she goes to a, kind of like an adopted grandparent's house. And then, we come home and it's tube feeds and medicine and bath. And I mean, she relies on us for care for everything.
In Arkansas, there are nearly 3,000 truly needy individuals like Skylar on the Medicaid waiting list. Since the state voted to expand Obamacare, 79 people on that list have died while waiting
So
for
Skylar's
services.
been on the waiting list for 10 years. It's easier for me. I would receive more services if I quit my job and stayed at home and allowed the state to pay for things. I would get more services that way. But, I'm about to finish my master's and I've worked really hard and I want to provide for my family more so gonna provide. And there's a minimum financial, amount that you can make, and it's low. And I want more for myself and more for my family. And, I finished my bachelor's degree as a single mom with her, and so I work really hard, and I am very determined to have a great life and to, achieve things professionally. So it wasn't an option, but it's a lot of struggle if you wanna work and be a full-time mom and, try to provide. I think the hardest thing that legislators don't realize is because they don't deal with it on a day-to-day basis. They just see figures, they see dollar figures. I wish they could come live a day in my life and just see, what we go through on a daily basis and, see, what the struggles we have just to help find someone in the summer. Like every summer we're scrambling, do you know someone that can help us? Do you know someone that can drive her? Or I wish that they could experience the things that families do. What is frustrating is that, like on the Medicaid waiver list, we've always just been a number. And so I've seen people get services because they cheated the system. And I've seen people get services because they were just higher on the list and they filled out their packet maybe 2 days before we did or sent it in. And I've never agreed that they don't base services off of need. And I've had parents tell me how to cheat the system just so we could move up on the list. I would rather struggle to provide and struggle to get what she needs than to just stick her in some place and hope that they're gonna take care of her. So she's been on the waiting list for 10 years, and we actually just found out that she was approved.
Update, after being informed in early 2017, Skylar's going to finally end, Overman's received devastating news. In July 2017, Skylar's family learned she would not be approved for services. Skylar continues to wait. I looked it up in the state of Kansas. The latest participation report that they have says there are 1,500 physically disabled and 4,000 developmentally disabled Kansans on their Medicaid waiting list. Unfortunately, I did also do the math. The state cost for Medicaid expansion over a 10-year period is the same cost of eliminating the current traditional Medicaid waiting list. So we could have taken that money and eliminated about 5,500 Kansans that are currently waiting for services. But instead, we're going to give it to adults, non-disabled, 19 to 64 years of age, that could get a job in a state where it has the lowest unemployment rate it's seen in 40 years, and we're gonna give them that subsidy instead. Any questions? Do you understand? Before I keep going, let me say one more thing. As Republicans or as conservatives per se, I think it's important that we all understand government has a role in society. We don't believe it should, infringe on our rights or whatnot, but we do think government should be available to help those who can't help themselves, to help the hard cases, right? And I think that's why we have traditional Medicaid. Who's traditional Medicaid helping? Children, pregnant women, those who are very low income, and then most importantly, those who are disabled or blind. Those are individuals, right, who honestly could need our help, right? Those who are the hard cases. Medicaid expansion, unfortunately, provides our tax dollars to those who choose not to work, who choose not to enter the workforce, who choose not to get private insurance, who may have figured that for them it's better to live on a government paycheck, and that's not good for society. We don't want to foster that type of dependency. Big chart, don't worry about it. I'll tell you what to look at. So the last question was whether it really helps improve the health of Kansans. Medicaid expansion will not. And, you know, relative to those who are taking private insurance. And then for those on traditional Medicaid, expansion affects them too, by keeping them on their waiting list and diverting the resources that really could help them get the services that they need. Next. Does Medicaid expansion improve the state budget? What you have here in this big chart, you don't need to look at all the numbers, but what you have are about 2 years after 2 years after most states expanded Medicaid expansion, what did they predict in terms of who would, you know, take up on that enrollment? Remember, Medicaid expansion is for adults 19 to 64 years of age, making under 138% of the federal poverty limit. When states propose passing Medicaid expansion, they of course have to know how much it's going to cost. To know how much it's going to cost, they have to guess how many people are going to sign up for the program. In Kansas, do you guys know what the number everybody's talking about is? It's like people think 130, 150,000 Kansans will sign up if they pass Medicaid expansion. Other states have done that too. That's what the second column kind of shows, max enrollment. So as an example, Connecticut thought they were going to get 113,000. This table is really interesting because it takes those initial projections from every state and then it says, okay, what was the reality? How many people did sign up 2 years later? Out of all those states, let's see here, enrollment projections for those states underestimated the actuals by 110%. Meaning, they predicted people would sign up for expansion, and then 2 years later it doubled. Doubled, more than what they expected. California, Louisiana, Arizona, Colorado, Indiana, Minnesota, they've even resorted to raising taxes on hospitals, insurers, or the sale of alcohol in order to cover costs. So remember, they make a projection saying, look, when we do Medicaid expansion, we're going to get X number of people, and so we're going to allocate this amount of money for X number of people. If X number of people doubles, then that means the cost of it has doubled. So in order to cover the cost, some states are taxing hospitals, or taxing insurance, or taxing things like alcohol and cigarettes in order to cover the cost. So here's Colorado right next door. Colorado would guess that they would have 187,000 people sign up. 2 years later, 446,000 people signed up. That's a difference of 139%. Let's see, what's another fun one? Let's do California. California thought they were going to get 910,000 people to sign up. They got 3.8 million. That's 322% more than what they expected. What's another egregious one? New York, 76,000. Oh my goodness, that's ridiculous. How do you only think 76,000 you're gonna get? They ended up getting 285,000. That's 276% higher than what they expected. And it doesn't matter what kind of state this is. You have arguably red states somewhat, like Ohio. You have plenty of blue states here, obviously. But even Kentucky is a somewhat red state. Every state that has expanded Medicaid has seen their projections, or has seen actuals exceed their projections, which means it's over budget. Louisiana. Let's see here. Where's Louisiana? Do I have Louisiana up here? I don't. Louisiana, this is an expansion model admired by Governor Kelly, and I say admired because she has said verbatim, I really want to enact the Medicaid expansion model that we've seen in Louisiana. I really like it. I think it'll do wonders here. Well, about Louisiana, they underestimated their enrollment by 100,000 people. And then even worse, an audit was done by their Louisiana Department of Health, and they found that the state paid out up to $85 million to expansion recipients who actually didn't qualify for the program. In fact, I have it in my notes somewhere. Bear with me. Let's see. There was testimony given to Senate Finance Subcommittee about audits on Medicaid expansion states. They had found, as an example, Colorado somewhat similar to Louisiana, they paid $66.5 million to ineligible expansion recipients. New York did about, let's see here, about $500 million. California did about $1 billion. Out of all the states that they had reviewed, they had found the states had paid roughly $1.8 billion to expansion recipients who shouldn't have qualified for the program in the first place. What makes you think Kansas will be any different? Ohio. 2014, former Governor Kasich, remember he ran for president in 2016? He promised enrollment for Medicaid expansion would never exceed 447,000 adults. In fact, it was so bad, Ohio legislature tried to pass a bill to freeze enrollment, saying, okay, we can't take any more, so that they can better control costs. Any questions?
One of the arguments that Senator Longmire gave me was that the bill that's being considered in Topeka will tax the hospitals to cover what Medicaid expansion will cost the state of Kansas. My question is, if that would pass and we underestimate just like everybody else has, will that tax go up also?
That's a great question. We'll talk about that.
Okay.
Thanks for coming, guys.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Really appreciate it. Hope you learned something.
Oh, yeah.
So busy kids.
And your name is Dustin, is that right?
Correct.
So, a theme that I'm going to use, a lot of the bills that they pass is, it just seems like they're very negligent in looking over applicants. That's just to put it lightly. So, revising their bills to try and make it better for them, to make stricter requirements to be, even to apply, might help them lower their costs, or what would you say?
You can put, because it's a state and federal program, you're kind of limited in terms of the options you can do to try to limit application enrollment. You'll see with the bill that's being proposed now, there are some attempts at tweaking the Medicaid expansion bill to cover costs. And I want you to keep that question in mind, because I'll answer whether those things really have a chance of working or not. But anybody have a question about whether expansion can really help state budgets or whatnot? Do we all get the idea that unfortunately doesn't work? There's always some sort of... Next question, will Medicaid expansion save struggling hospitals? Now, you know, I'm not gonna beat around the bush here. Unfortunately, we all have an understanding that hospitals out in sparsely populated areas are unfortunately not doing as well as, of course, their urban counterparts. And that's not unique to Kansas. As you see in this chart here by Navigant, you know, everywhere you see red is where there is a struggling rural hospital that's been reported. And it is obviously all pervasive throughout the Midwest and the South. So why are rural hospitals struggling? I'll talk about three things. Payer mix degradation, I'll explain what that is, the decline of inpatient care, and the inability to leverage innovation. When it comes to the first one, payer mix degradation, I think you can all understand that in those sparsely populated areas, in those rural areas, jobs are just not as plentiful as they used to be. You know, whereas, let's say 50, 60, 70 years ago, you would find a myriad of different types of opportunities, whether it could be information, financial services, some sort of lawyering, maybe architecture, as well as agriculture and manufacturing. Today, it's really just agriculture and manufacturing out there. And so, because of that, you've seen what we call a deterioration in the payer mix. The residents who then live in the area, because there's only two real industries out there, either they are very old, right, or they are very young. Those who are around our age have probably left to go to the city in order to find better economic opportunities for work, for employment, and better quality of life. And so those who are left over, those who are young, or those who are old, are only the ones around that can pay for medical services, which means they don't. Which means there's a lot of uncompensated care, right, for these types of rural hospitals. That's what payer mix degradation means. It means the types of payers in these hospital services in the rural areas, they're just not as strong as they used to be. A lot of people just simply can't pay because they're either relatively old or relatively too young. Decline of inpatient care. Many rural hospitals were built post-World War II, and I don't think I need to tell you that the environment after World War II is very different than the environment today. The average, let's see, rural hospital has 50 beds, 300 employees, but has a daily census of 7 patients. They're huge relative to the number of people that they serve, right? And I don't know if you're aware of this, but even here in the city, whether it's Emporia, I live in Lawrence, a lot of medical services are all being pushed to outpatient care. So your urgent care clinics, your prompt care clinics, rarely do you see commonly, what do you call it? Common treatment is done in a hospital. It's all done in some sort of outpatient care, and that speaks to the decline of inpatient care. And then finally, the inability to leverage innovation. Many budget-strapped hospitals are unable to keep up with technological trends, simply because they don't have the funds to purchase the latest technology that can help them cover costs. It's something that urban hospital has a much better chance of buying, and so unfortunately rural hospitals are struggling a little bit in order to keep up to their urban counterparts. But if I could sum all these 3 down, it would be the economy and bad business practices, right? Payer mix degradation, decline of inpatient care, that all speaks to changing economic factors, right? Anything beyond that has to do with the inability of those rural hospitals to adapt to that environment. Let me ask you a question. Let's say you have a private firm acting badly. I don't know, say Starbucks, since I still see that cup there. Let's say Starbucks is acting badly. It makes a mistake, it hurts its customers in some way, shape, or form. What happens to it?
They lose money.
They lose money. Either they adapt and fix their mistake, or they lose money. Let's say government made a mistake. Government treated taxpayers badly. What happens to it?
They still get their money.
They raise taxes.
They raise taxes. Someone somewhere down the line will say, look. The only reason why this program isn't working, or the only reason why people are being affected so negatively, is because we didn't give them enough money. A private firm doesn't have that luxury, right? They have to adapt, and they can't adapt by raising Starbucks prices, right? That's only gonna make the problem worse, right? Yet for government, unfortunately, that's where our line of thinking happens, because government, unlike the private sector, has no way to check whether it's made a mistake. It has no way to recognize bad behavior. It has no way to adapt. It has no way to recognize that it needs to change. And part of that is because our taxes are forcibly given to the government. Now, how those taxes are used, you can of course make an argument that some government programs are most certainly needed. But the fact that it's guaranteed income, as opposed to the private sector where if Starbucks makes a mistake, you just don't buy from them anymore, that can't happen with government. And so what Medicaid expansion can do to these struggling hospitals is it will give them a stream of money, but by giving them a stream of money, it now tells them they don't need to adapt to their practices, right? Or at least it discourages them from fixing their bad business practices. If we really treated these hospitals like the private sector, they would adapt, and some of them would survive and some of them would not. Ooh, Fort Scott. Fort Scott's a really good example. In the news media, everybody was talking about Fort Scott because Fort Scott, they said, needed money for Medicaid expansion, and if we didn't do it, they would suffer. Obviously, we haven't passed Medicaid expansion yet, but guess what? The Fort Scott Hospital didn't suffer. It closed, but guess what? Other organizations took up the role, right? The whole city adapted, and those who are still in need of medical care in Fort Scott can still get the services that they need, even though the hospital is no longer present. we don't give that opportunity. We're not having a conversation like that, and we're not allowing the market to adapt. By providing a guaranteed income to these struggling hospitals, we give them an excuse to look the other way. So is expansion generally good policy? Well, we figured out that expansion unfortunately doesn't improve Kansans' health. Not only are they not better off relative to those who have private insurance, but it actually it leads to worse health outcomes for those under traditional Medicaid. Does Medicaid expansion improve the state budget? Well, no. What we have found were that on average, states that had expanded Medicaid saw costs that doubled more than what they expected. Excuse me. And then finally, will Medicaid expansion help struggling hospitals? And the answer is no. And the reason why is because Medicaid expansion doesn't get to the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem is a changing environment and a lack of adaptation. Medicaid expansion just gives you money, right? It doesn't address economic forces, and it doesn't address whether businesses will then implement good business practices. Okay, let's talk about the bipartisan Medicaid expansion bill. There's Governor Kelly at the podium, and then this guy there is the Senate Majority Leader. His name is Jim Denning. Here's another Republican. Who's this guy, Michael?
I'm
I don't
blanking
know.
on his name. He's got really.
Senator
Was it
Longbottom.
Longbottom, okay.
Our
so
senator, he's our senator.
Oh, he's your senator? I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Don't even.
I apologize for not knowing.
That's okay.
Well, it's funny that I pointed to him then, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's very convenient. So there's Senator Longbine, and then there's Senator Denning, standing with Governor Kelly and her LG, talking about how they have finally come up with a bipartisan expansion bill. A lot of words, let's go through this slowly. So in this expansion bill, they have some tweaks to it to try to preemptively control the costs. In here is a request that we want to expand Medicaid for Kansans only up to 100% of the federal poverty level. Traditionally, Medicaid expansion goes up to 133%. So this is an attempt to cover costs, saying, okay, look, we just won't go up to 133, let's just go up to 100. As for those who have income between 100 and 138%, they want to be placed on the federal exchange market. So slow down a little bit. You have state Medicaid expansion, right, which covers your medical bills for up to 138%. But then you also have Obamacare through their healthcare.gov. Remember that a couple years ago, right? Healthcare.gov provides you a tax credit that will offset your health insurance. And they only work for those from 100% to like 400%. So this expansion bill says we're only going to use the state dollars to cover Kansans up to 100% of the federal poverty line. And then for those between 100 and 138, we're going to put them on healthcare.gov so that they can get a tax credit to offset their health insurance coverage. If this request is denied, then we're just going to do full expansion. We're just going to do it. That was the compromise. Okay, that was the compromise. Next, they also had in here another tweak. Oh man, my language isn't that good here. I write here, there was no requirement to look for work to receive Medicaid expansion benefits. So let me backtrack a little bit. One concern that was brought up by Republicans was, wait, so you're gonna give these tax dollars to able-bodied, non-disabled adults, but you're not going to put them out in the workforce. Why wouldn't these people just take the check and stay home and not really, do something with their lives if they're physically and mentally able to do so? So the Republicans have said, well, since we don't want that to happen, what if we give them a work requirement? What if we'll say, okay, fine, we'll give you this expansion to cover your health care, but we want you to go find a job. And if you don't find a job, we're gonna take it away, right? That was the Republican position. What we ended up with in this bipartisan bill is no requirement to look for work, but they do have to answer 2 work-related survey questions. All right. That's bipartisan part. And cost. The program will cost $70 million a year over the next 10 years. $70 million is the 10%. Remember expansion, state pays for 10% of Medicaid expansion, so they estimated 70 million will be Kansas's share of 10%. And remember back to the, well, I don't know, we haven't passed it yet. So that's a good question. But you're right, that 70 million is tied to some belief of how many people will sign up for the program. And 35 million will be paid through taxing hospitals. So 70 million is the state cost. To cover that 70 million, they want to make hospitals and healthcare providers pay for 35 million of it. Any questions on the outlines of that?
Where's the other 35 million gonna come from?
The state budget.
My pocket.
Yeah, that exactly. I just forgot my question.
Maybe we'll come back. Okay, any other questions? So, cost 70 million, they're gonna make hospitals pay for 35 of it.
Well, if the hospitals just increase what they charge the rest of us to make up for those taxes?
We'll see. So 3 red flags. And by the way, all that I'm talking about here in the presentation are in the handouts you got. So you don't need to look at them right now. They're just more detailed than the presentation I'm doing up here today. So anyway, 3 red flags I find for this expansion bill. Former President Joe Biden, oh, he's the front runner. He said taxing hospitals to pay for Medicaid expansion is a scam. You know, Obama created the law, and yet they think taxing hospitals is a scam. Let me explain how. Obamacare passed in 2014. No. I think it was one of the first things that was passed. Anyway, expansion was allowed in 2014 with the idea that President Obama and Vice President Joe Biden understood that Obamacare was very expensive on the federal budget. So to accommodate the abnormally large expense for it, they wanted to push some more costs onto the state governments as to a way to make it more affordable. You guys can kind of understand that. So their argument was, look, the federal government will pay for expansion for the first 2 years or so, and then we're gonna start giving you 5% arguably of the cost. And then by 2020, we're gonna give you 10%, which is kind of where we are now, right? And hope that states cover 10%, we'll cover 90%. If we're good, then we're good. And we're just gonna hope that happens. What they had found was that after they started pushing the cost onto the states were working with hospitals to avoid paying their share. Here's how it worked. Let's say you guys are all different hospitals, and I'm the state government, and Michael is the feds. Okay? So I'll say, okay, I have to pay, pick a number, $100 million for Medicaid expansion. I'm gonna tax you, right? And you'll give me the funds for Medicaid expansion. So I tax all of you, you give me $100 million. I'll go to the feds and I say, hey, look, feds, I have $100 million I can spend on healthcare, will you match it? Federal government, by statute, has to, says yes. So they give me $100 million, and now I have $200 million. And then I give you back your taxes. I give you back the $100 million. I get the $100 million to pay for expansion. You guys get taxed, but you guys get that money back anyway. Who's the only one that loses? Think of the cash flow. Michael.
Every taxpayer in the US at that point.
Yeah.
Well, that's
Sorry.
true, you're right. You're the federal government, but it honestly comes back to us.
Yeah.
But out of the 3 organizations here, right, Michael ends up paying more than what he intended. Michael initially wanted me to pay for 10% of the expansion, but because I used federal matching rules, I taxed hospitals, told the federal government that I had matching funds, they matched it, and then I gave the original tax revenue back to the hospitals. You guys are no different. I have my money, and the federal government is losing.
Man,
Vice President Joe Biden saw that.
that's just me.
Vice President Biden saw that and called it a scam. Okay. Everybody understand that? Do I need to explain it again? Okay, as for those tweaks, we're going to only pay for expansion up to people with 100% of the federal poverty limit, and everybody else can go to healthcare.gov, right? That is a tweak to help control the cost. But guess what? Now, let me show you the number right. They've all been denied by the feds. This is not a unique Kansas plan. In fact, Utah, Idaho, Georgia, Arkansas, Massachusetts, Wisconsin have all tried and were denied their partial expansion methods. And now those same states are forced to expand Medicaid with no caveats. In short, federal government says Medicaid expansion is an all or nothing proposal. Has nothing to do with the president, right? It just has to do with the letter of the law, right? The letter of the law does not allow those types of tweaks. You either need to expand fully or you don't do it at all. But this was part of the compromise. Work requirements. As I said, that the bipartisan bill doesn't have work requirements, it just has a survey question. I say here, Kansans should be very wary of arguments that the plan includes a work referral. That's what this was referred to, a work referral, not a work requirement. In reality, a work referral is just lip service with no actual teeth to get the job done. Arkansas tried the same thing when it expanded Medicaid, but was wildly unsuccessful. Here's how. Less than 5% of those who took their Arkansas referral got a job. Remember, this was the same state that Skylar Overman was from in that video that you heard. Arkansas has since pursued common sense work requirements for its Medicaid expansion population to try to help more individuals move from welfare to work. So, not having work requirements is only going to accelerate the budget costs because it's not going to push people into the workforce. If all you're going to do is make them a survey and you're not going to force them out the door, then they're just going to do the survey and they're going to stay at home. Not to mention, as I said, in terms of expansion, right, traditional Medicaid is supposed to help the hard cases. Government is supposed to help those who can't help themselves. As for everybody else, if we're going to help you, you need to give something back in return. And so work requirements is popular with Kansas voters. They understand that. They don't think that people who have the ability to work should sit at home and get a government paycheck or be paid out of their own wallets. I think I gave you guys a survey too, saying how popular work requirements are with Kansas. Okay, so now we're going to get into the number that proponents have been saying will help Medicaid expansion. They always say Medicaid expansion is going to help 150,000 Kansans. It's going to add them onto the program. That chart over here on the left is from the Kansas Health Institute. It is the potential enrollment of Kansas adults if Medicaid is expanded. Because out of that 150,000 number that everyone likes to claim, 54,000 of them are children. Are children covered under Medicaid expansion? No, they're covered under traditional Medicaid, which means if we really wanted to, we could help them now. But anyway, so 54,000, so now it's down to about 100,000 adults or so. Let's look at three particular sections. Look at this group here. These people are insured, that's what the green stands for. They were insured, excuse me, and they are now newly eligible, they shift to Medicaid. So about 37,000 adults have insurance, will drop their insurance, and will go on Medicaid expansion. That's part of that 150,000. And this second group here is called woodwork adults. These guys are uninsured. And let's see here, they have less than 38% of the federal poverty limit. They are currently eligible and they will enroll in Medicaid. But guess what? They have income less than 38% of the federal poverty line. They have very low income. Guess where they should be going? Traditional Medicaid. Traditional Medicaid covers children, pregnant women, blind disabled adults, and very low income families. Families making less than 38% of the federal poverty limit. So the first group, for the first subset from the adults under expansion, have private insurance. The second group go into traditional Medicaid. And finally, this group, newly eligible, enroll in Medicaid, part of that group can go on to healthcare.gov right now. Not all of this 57,000, just a couple of them. But ultimately, guess what? 76% of Medicaid expansion recipients have alternative health insurance options. Either they are children and can go on traditional Medicaid, either they are adults with very low income and they can go on traditional Medicaid, either they have a job with private insurance, right? Or they can get onto healthcare.gov today and get a tax credit to offset their insurance. So only 25%, 25% is can uniquely be helped by Medicaid expansion. But guess what? I'm not even done yet. We have the job market out there. And according to the Kansas Department of Labor, I did the numbers, 24% of the expansion population is about 30,000 people. The Kansas Department of Labor has a survey out there of job openings, all the types of job openings that are available in the state. And I found that there are 30,000 job openings out there that provide health insurance. About a third of them don't need a high school diploma. Or excuse me, need a high school diploma or less. So in fact, lawmakers can serve 150,000 Kansans today if they wanted to, without passing Medicaid expansion. But we don't talk about it. So in summary, expansion has contributed to the accelerated growth of state government budgets because no one can estimate, no one can guess how many people will respond to that the taxpayer incentive. Studies find that those who are eligible for expansion are no healthier than those under private insurance or no insurance, because remember, healthcare, Medicaid expansion isn't a healthcare product, it is a financial product, it is a taxpayer subsidy. It says nothing about whether you can get better care related to those under private insurance. As you heard with Skylar Overman, expansion diverts taxpayer dollars away from those who truly need it. Medicaid expansion won't improve the financial position of rural hospitals because the issue with rural hospitals isn't one that can be solved by Medicaid expansion. It's an economic issue and it needs to be adjusted through proper management practices. And finally, as we just showed, expansion pulls individuals from other health insurance options, such as traditional Medicaid, the federal exchanges, and private insurance, all at the taxpayer's dime. All right, that's it. Any questions?
Everyone looks at me. Everyone knows I have a question. I think I asked this last time I saw you, but I don't think it was like voted on yet. And I know you don't really talk about like social issues, but since now, the Values and Growth Amendment was not passed, do you know anything about taxpayer dollars directly going to abortions, and would Medicaid expansion cover abortions in the state?
Unfortunately, the Kansas Policy Institute is not allowed to speak on
Okay.
that. Not that I don't have an opinion, I'm just not allowed to publicly express it, working on behalf of the Kansas Policy Institute. Michael, are you in a different position?
AFP's kind of in a similar place. I went to Governor Kelly and Senator Denning's public tour in Wichita, and they talked about that, so maybe after this I can share what they said, but.
Thank you.
I apologize for
No,
that.
it's okay. I don't want to get in trouble.
No problem. Anything that you've heard from, proponents of expansion, telling you that it's all sunshine and rainbows, anything in particular that you've heard, this would be a good time to get it out now.
I wanted to ask you, I follow you on Twitter.
I make people very upset.